Hello and welcome to week 8. It's our 8th colloquium of the Public Interest Technology series. And today we have a special guest. It's the second of 3 parts. Last fortnight, we heard from Dr. Michael Eldred from Cologne in Germany. Today, we're going to hear from Pascal Zachary, who's in California. And in the new year, we will likely hear from MG Michael. So we've got the philosopher 2 weeks ago, the historian today and journalist today, and the theologian next year, kicking off the year of public interest technology seminars. Now, we've had an amazing week, absolutely amazing. We had the Public Interest Technology Universities Network, where there was an open day. Dr. Roba Abbas and myself spent a great deal of time preparing seminars that predominantly came from faculty, students, and staff at Arizona State University from the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. We also had a 4-day straight panel, roughly between 12 and 14 hours a day for 4 days in a row. And that was the IEEE Symposium on Technology and Society for 2020. We had about 600 people involved in that, if not more. We had about 400 authors, 200 peer-reviewed papers and abstracts, and we also had an incredible list of panels. And we're all still probably recovering from that 4-day event. I do want to give a big shout out to Miss Cindy Dick and Miss Melissa Waite, our logistics and events personnel who made that conference just fly. We've received so much feedback that the conference has restored people's faith in conferences, that it has helped to propel forward what public interest technology means, and that the outcome, as well as being peer-reviewed papers and the assemblage of a community dedicated to public interest tech, it was really about the human spirit, inclusivity, generosity, and giving. People gave of their time. They decided they'd come on for one talk and ended up staying for 4 days. So today, at the end of this wonderful program, Inclusive, is Pascal Zachary's talk. And what I want to do is briefly tell you who I am. I'm Katina Michael. I'm the chair, the program chair of the Masters of Science in Public Interest Technology at Arizona State University. And as we said a fortnight ago, we had Dr. Michael Eldred, and today we have Pascal Zachary. And in giving a little bit of insight into who is Greg, I want to tell you that his talk today is dedicated to digital innovation and the public interest, with a tweak at the end, back to the future as a question mark. His bio is quite incredible. I don't know where to begin. He was the chief Silicon Valley writer for the San Jose Mercury News around 1987. He then led the digital technology coverage of the Wall Street Journal between 1989 and 2005. He had a ping column on innovation for the Times in 2007 and 8. And of course, most of us know him as a professor at Arizona State University, where he drew many crowds. I was fortunate to be in his classroom at least 3 times from memory, and to have many lunches with Greg, whom I always felt was quite deep. He also taught at Stanford University. A lot of people don't know that, between 2007 and 2009, and the University of California at Berkeley between 94 and 97, 2001 and 2002, and he's guest lectured for so many of America's primary institutions. Perhaps I first heard about him through his great book, Endless Frontier, that has received hundreds, if not thousands, of citations since it was published in 1997. And he takes on sort of a historical but journalistic flair in that book. And I can't wait to hear more about that today, among the other things. I think you can catch some of Greg's latest work in IEEE Spectrum. He's well known for his writing there on engineering, on cognitive enhancement, on invisible technology, on trouble with targets, making the web better, and so much more. So without embarrassing him perhaps anymore, I'm going to hand over to Greg and say welcome.
Welcome, Katina, and thank you very much for that generous introduction. I don't have much experience.
3 little bridge things to hold that in place. One of them fell in when I lifted the.
If people want to go on mute, if they're not on mute, I'll just place them on mute. Thank you very much. Go ahead. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, thanks for your gracious invitation, and I was very excited to be a small part of your PIT initiative, and also it's great to hear that the Tech and Society program went so well. I've prepared some comments without slides in the hopes of just getting to the heart of things more easily. So, I'm talking to you from my home a few miles north of Berkeley, and I've lived in California mostly since 1978. I want to achieve today, at this moment in time when, because of the pandemic and the profound yearning for a technological fix to our predicament, the digitalization or the digital mediation of everyday life, it's accelerating from an already robust level. And the topic of my talk, digital innovation and the public interest back to the future, I want to suggest that we already know collectively from our shared sense of the past and past responses to emerging technologies, we already know a great deal about how a new movement around public interest technology might develop and critically engage the current wave of digitalization, as well as parallel challenges in biomedicine, the environment, energy, transportation, and physical security. So today I want to say something about the history of public interest movements in the US. I want to examine critically, although briefly, the twin concepts of public or publics, note the plural, and interest or interests, which invariably forces us to examine which publics do we privilege and whose interests do we seek to advance or retard. I want to review quite quickly and in a sloppy fashion the history of regulation of business and technology from the 1930s, a period of regulatory fervor, through the 1980s, when a backlash begins, and what ensues is some 40 years of fervent deregulation, covering the presidencies of Reagan, the Bushes, Clinton, Obama, and Trump. And we will throw a glance at what could be a new period of regulatory enthusiasm, which appears to be unfolding with the Justice Department's proposed action against Google, the election of Biden as president, and the flexing of muscles by large states such as California and New York with regards to technology companies operating in their midst. And we even see that with the insistence that these large states want to review the safety of vaccines in a way that parallels what the FDA and CDC do. So these growing forces may be well timed to boost the public interest technology movement. And I don't know, Dr. Michael, if you've articulated the public interest concept as a movement, but I'm going to elevate it to the status of a movement. So
I agree. I agree.
Good. I will close by providing an outline for an agenda for the public interest technology movement, both within the US and globally. So my overall aim is to stimulate questions, to ignite discussion, and perhaps even some arguments, because American responses to technological change, while generally enthusiastic, now are routinely polarizing. And, we could do, of course, as Dr. Michael is doing, an entire course or series of courses on this subject. So naturally, I'm going to be, superficial in some sense. Let me present one final prefatory comment. My premise in thinking about the PIT agenda as a robust, sustainable, novel, and progressive framework for understanding policy and innovation and technological change is to remind myself as well as you that emerging technologies long have engaged all of us at the level of law, commerce, regulation, norms, culture, and even spirituality and religion. In America, who gains and benefits from emerging technologies has stimulated and sustained a robust movement of public interest law, service, and community for more than 100 years. Starting with the advent of radio around World War I and deepening with the spread of electrification in the 1920s and 30s, public interest law and regulation deeply shaped the character of these emerging innovations and electronics generally. Public interest movements reached their zenith in the regulation of telephony and airlines from the 50s to the 70s. Aviation was, of course, a singular dual-use technology that both the military, business, and civil society cared deeply about. Similarly, telephony by the 1940s was deemed an essential service run by what was then perceived by Americans as a rigid, if benevolent, monopoly. Ma Bell, by an agreement with the federal government, refused to enter the field of computing, even though its Bell Labs invented the building blocks of digital computers and communications networks. Regulations across these two technological domains were tight. Americans could only have a single black rotary phone in their homes, which was the case when I was a child. And while the national government didn't regulate prices, state and public utility commissions did. And these public utility commissions, often when public interest movements arise, are the first target. They have a lot of power, although they've tended to be ignored by activists. Airlines saw federal regulation, though through the FAA, which also decided to socialize air traffic control. We could easily imagine that air traffic control could be done by a company, say Amazon, and they would be in charge of it and everything would be fine, I suppose. But this is a public service that's governed and operated like any federal agency. Airlines in the 1970s had a public service mentality. They served certain cities like Fargo, North Dakota. Let's just say all of the Dakotas were served at a loss. The government understood that the airlines were serving these cities at a loss and allowed airlines to, quote unquote, overcharge people in more popular routes. And that made ticket prices high, competition was low, and all airline routing decisions and destinations required explicit government approval. This is a useful reminder to those who think you cannot regulate digital technologies, for instance. Airlines ultimately won reprieve from these tight controls, but these tight controls are as American as laissez-faire. So, were we to review in detail the history of public interest efforts to shape the character of radio, electricity, telephony, television, and aviation, we would see clearly, A, that these world-altering technologies were deeply shaped by government policies for nearly a half century. B, that starting from 1980 and extending for 40 years to this essentially year, 2020, we experienced in the US a dramatic decline of regulatory and public interest approaches to innovation, which resulted by the mid-1990s in the triumph of techno-libertarianism. And that's why Al Gore invented the internet. That's why Bill Clinton oversaw tax-free activities for internet retailers and immunity from any liability. That's why President Obama sustained those. That's why President Obama said before he left office, what he really wanted to do was become a venture capitalist. So this period of 40 years may be coming to an end. There may be a revival of public interest technology movement that can help civil society and government construct a better balance between techno-libertarianism on the one hand and over-regulation of emerging technologies, the continued fear that government will hold too tight a grip. Now, before I say a few things about myself, I just want to have a shout out to engineer Bamana Gishu from Makerere University. He and I have worked closely, and I'm very proud of the work he's doing on both a project called the African Cloud, the Ugandan Cloud, and also his work that's been honored by Google. And then I was surprised to see, with a very interesting and delightful hairstyle, my very own sister, who is in the audience. I was glad to see her because she lives in New York and I have not seen her for quite a while. So let me say a few things about my approaches to understanding technological change that are not obvious or clear, because I'm not a card-carrying member of the STS movement, and I am also not an economist. So I've done significant work in journalism, but my comments today chiefly reflect my engagement with historians and historical scholarship on engineering, science, and innovation. Katina kindly mentioned the book I'm best known for in this realm, and so I won't belabor it, but I would just say that when I began the project of that book in 1989, I was on a fellowship for an academic year at University of Michigan, and I was animated by a question that deeply troubled me, which was, how did the US military come to dominate science and technology from 1940 to 1975? And 1975 is a fundamental year because that's the year the personal computer was invented. That's the year that Bill Gates gets called up by Paul Allen and told by Paul Allen, hey, buy this magazine, Popular Science or Popular Electronics, and we've got to build a personal computer. And then, of course, Steve Jobs also gets caught up in this. And, because I'm a storyteller as well as a scholar, I tried to answer this question through Bush's life. And Vannevar Bush's life, and some of my comments about technological change, I think, are deeply conditioned by my understanding of World War II and the early Cold War. So Bush is best known as President Roosevelt's S&T advisor during World War II. And it's very notable today during this pandemic. President Trump picked a science advisor. He managed to find a Republican physicist from the middle of the country, but he's really played no role in this. And the science advisor to many presidents in the past was a central figure. Bush was also an operational manager. In the 1930s, he designed and built the most powerful computers in the world. They were called differential analyzers. And in the 1940s, he alone decided with President Roosevelt whether to proceed with an atomic bomb. He oversaw the work of Groves and Oppenheimer, the military and physicist leaders of the Manhattan Project, though he relied heavily on James Conant, then president of Harvard. And Bush and Conant wrote the first memos on the nature of atomic weapons. This is in the fall of 1944, and predicted that the US monopoly might only last 5 years. And after Roosevelt's death, Bush joined with other members of the interim committee to advise Truman to proceed and use the 2 bombs on Japan. The way I look at nuclear weapons history has a lot of influence on how I see things in other domains. Second, and this is not unrelated to me because nuclear weapons were from birth a global technology, I have significant international experience, having worked in 25 countries, chiefly from 95 to 2010, and included a 3-year stint in Europe, 3 years with the Gates Foundation, where I worked chiefly on African affairs. And in 2001, I decided to devote a substantial period to issues in Africa. And I spent a great deal of time in Ghana and Uganda on computing, communications, agriculture, and higher education. So in the fall of 2010, having made about 50 research visits to Africa in the prior 10 years, I accepted a position at ASU in Tempe, and I sought to circle back to my earlier engagements with the history of technology, and particularly the present and future of digital innovation. And I met many gifted colleagues at ASU, and of course, including Dr. Michael. Two things I did at ASU that, again, I think underscore the importance of the history of nuclear weapons to me and understanding emerging technologies. I taught for the first time, no one had ever taught a class at ASU on the history of nuclear weapons. I taught it for 3 classes with Dr. Sybil Francis, who was a historian of the Livermore Labs. And to this day, no human activity has received such a high share of funds, a high percentage of resources, as nuclear weapons did in the United States from 1940 to 1963. So we continue to have a lot of lessons we can learn from nuclear weapons, but interestingly, I don't see people trying to draw these lessons. The other end of the spectrum, kind of the kinder, gentler Greg Zachary that emerged after a long period of suppression. I participated for about 5 or 6 years in a group at ASU led by Hava Samuelson, Gaiman Bennett, and the inimitable Ben Hurlbut, looking at the collision between religion, spirituality, and the culture and sociology of technological change. As part of our scholarship, I studied the past, present, and future of consciousness, and I emphasize what I call the race between the digital and the biomedical as approaches and pathways to expansion of cognition or mind expansion. And I taught a class for 5 years called The Quest for Enhanced Consciousness, from the Greeks to Google. And part of, I think, one of the challenges ahead is that human enhancement as a technological project requires some kind of public interest or public engagement, and it doesn't have any right now. Okay, so let's look at the term animating us today, because my 1 degree is actually in philosophy, and I can upset people unduly by questioning their use of terms and what do they mean. So let's do that with the term public interest, because it's a deceptively simple concept. And liberals often presume that the public interest is what liberals want, and antithetical to the public interest is what conservatives want. Religious people are antithetical to the public interest, and secularists are in favor of the public interest. This reminds me of a slogan called "The future is for everyone." Well, I mean, similarly, public interest is a very democratic concept. And we often assume, we're going to first look at what's the public. We often assume there is a public, a unified entity of publicness. And yet, as long ago as 100 years ago, Walter Lippmann, a public intellectual and an important political writer, advanced a concept that is perhaps even more salient today of, quote, the phantom public. Well, I think we know who the phantom public is now. They are the people supporting Donald Trump, I suppose. But this is a fascinating analysis of the concept of public from Lippmann's elitist standpoint, he was saying, he was essentially arguing that the public really doesn't show up, and we have to organize our representative democracy with that in mind. And I'll return to that in a moment. So intellectual history and political philosophy also illuminates the term interest. So political thinkers once routinely talked about the national interest, or they talked about special interests. So nations had interests in roughly the same way individuals had them. And in today's identity-infused context, interests are often conjoined with identities. So Black people have interests, lesbians have interests, Italian Americans have interests, etc. Religious people have interests, evangelicals have interests. So the term public interest may obscure more than it reveals. And I'm not saying that to bring Dr. Michael down. Now, first of all, she's an incredibly ebullient person. She's nearly always in a good mood, and that's perfect because this public interest concept has a creaky foundation, and it can be easily hijacked in different directions. So what do we end up when we unpeel and unpack these two terms conjoined? A, we are dealing with publics, plural, and we are dealing with multiple interests. So we have a multiplicity of publics and we have a multiplicity of interests. And when you begin to mix and match these, it can prove divisive. Which publics, whose interests are we fighting for? Which publics, whose interests are at stake or will be protected or enhanced by policies relating to an emerging technology? So let's look at a particular tension. What's the role of experts and expertise in public interest movements? Because public interest movements often talk about citizens. When I was getting out of college in 1976, right at the end of my college career, Ralph Nader started something called the Public Interest Research Group, PIRG, and it still exists in New York. And the public interest research movement was the notion that agencies and regulators could benefit from having more independent information. It was a response to regulatory capture. And if we think more deeply in the past, I mean, if Nader was 76, Dwight Eisenhower was 1961, 15 years earlier, he claimed that experts, a cabal of scientists and engineers, had so dominated subjects that we were their prisoners, that citizens were their prisoners. And I think that President Trump, without recognizing Eisenhower's progeny here, the roots of the anti-expertise movement, I mean, he's clearly anti-expertise. So this symmetry between public interest and expertise, it should not be presumed. It has to be one. It is true that many public interest movements have experts as part of them, but the public interest movement could also be anti-expert. And now back to the concept of publics, noting the plural, highlighting the plural. I'm not saying that publics are phantoms, but I'm saying that the public may be a phantom, that the country is too diverse and our interests are too different for there to be a single public. And we see this with polling. You know, we used to have a very robust polling industry that seemed to tell us how we were feeling. And now we have too much polarization and too many differences. So a good example of this tension is in California's tangled history of compulsory vaccinations. Both the left and the right in the 1990s began complaining that it wasn't fair, that they had to be forced to vaccinate their children to attend school. California then relaxed that requirement. And a few years ago, the state began making vaccines compulsory again. We see something similar in the lawsuits, the many lawsuits against public health measures to constrain people's movement that are based in some kind of medical justification, where the courts are saying, and particularly my favorite justice, Samuel Alito, who I hope will see the light one day and simply resign. Perhaps after a lot of pot smoking, he might just say, you know what, I'm causing too much trouble for America and I will resign. But Alito says the greatest forms of tyranny since slavery have occurred during our pandemic. So we know that this antagonism between the public interest and experts can exist, and people in this public interest movement who want to revive it and expand it should be paying attention to this. I want to look at two more aspects of the concept. One is the biggest threat to the public interest approach. It's regulatory capture, where private actors somehow gain control of the regulatory process and use the process to extend their power and to reduce the public's ability to influence that domain. Regulatory capture is prevalent. There's a long history of scholarship on it. And scholars and historians have often found that the largest players, meaning corporate players in many markets, welcome regulation, seek regulation, because they have the size and resources to comply with regulators and to influence regulators, while smaller rivals don't. One other point is about technology assessment. I know that a number of the ASU scholars that Katina has invited and that I know of worked at the Office of Technology Assessment, and would perhaps be sympathetic to public interest activity. But we should point out that technology assessment may inform and infuse with knowledge the public interest framework with expertise and an air of neutrality. But technology assessment is not a substitute for regulation and is often designed to deflect or prevent regulation in the public interest. Most technology assessment often concludes that private actors can make the necessary adaptations on their own, and that these adaptations need not be imposed on them by a regulatory authority. I'm not questioning the veracity of this or throwing it out for questioning. I'm more just saying I don't see technology assessment as in any way a natural bedfellow with public interest. In fact, I can see it at odds. In fact, the Office of Technology Assessment was created in the face of opposition from regulatory agencies that said, we're doing that. That's what we do at the FCC. That's what we do at the FDA. We don't need another agency to come in and assess to undermine our authority to regulate. It was definitely a sop by the deregulatory people to saying, well, okay, we don't want to regulate anything, but sure, we can think about some of the problems in advance. Why not? So, as a result, I'm uncomfortable with discussions about quote unquote governing technologies, or the notion that private actors or even technological systems as engineered artifacts themselves legislate, quote unquote, legislate in the manner of lawmakers. Dr. Hurlbut, who's a dear friend and a brilliant young person, and his mentor, Sheila Jasanoff, use this language a lot, but I prefer to talk more neutrally and strictly accurately about efforts to manage emerging and mature technologies and technological systems. In any case, whatever language we choose, encountering emerging technologies requires a deep understanding of the logics of these technologies so that we can figure out, will they scale? I mean, a couple of years ago, I had colleagues that went bananas, literally bananas, over driverless cars. We had Arizona was going to be, the ground zero of driverless cars. Where are those driverless cars now? What scales? And then how do markets or government funding sustain these emerging technologies? For me, managing these emerging technologies requires an understanding of the common good from the outset rather than the other way around. So what we might think as a emerging system of experts or regulators or the public interest all will have challenges because of the unpredictable nature of these emerging technologies. Does anyone have any questions before I launch into another segment? Or should I just keep going, Dr. Michael?
I think we're going to have a few questions. We're going to have questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand and unmute, they're welcome to pose their question to Greg. Who's going to be our first? Because I know one of the things, Greg, I've always appreciated in sitting with you and discussing things is how provocative you are. Mm-hmm. And you and I share quite a few sentiments, not everything, but quite a few. I enjoy listening to you because you challenge my mind. And I think today's seminar just shows we're not here to just wave the flag public interest technology without being critical and evaluating the term. And I think you raise many pertinent questions. We've got a response from your friend, the engineer from Africa. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Greg, for this exciting talk. I'm very glad to listen in. I've stayed up late to listen and enjoying it. It's past midnight here. So I just want to, follow up on your, well elaborated distinction between public interest and expertise movement. I just want to share your thoughts. So how do we strike a balance between sort of this expertise movement and the public interest and the and expertise movement? How do we strike a balance between these two sort of competing interests?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one way we do is to build in civil society communities that have expertise that can assist political actors and challenge companies, in particular private power, that have expertise. And then the other is to recognize that expertise might not be democratic in the sense that we think of participation and access to decision-making as democratic. In what way do we privilege experts, and how do we do so? Most of the regulatory capture becomes, turns on expertise. So the Boeing Max, the 737 plane, which was just approved again today, to my surprise, it wasn't possible for independent people, meaning people outside of the FAA and Boeing, to really understand what was at issue because no one had the expertise. And I think within gene editing, you also hear that same argument that it's the actors that have the expertise. And if you're going to afford privilege to expertise and knowledge, you've got to let those actors, those privileged actors, have some special sway. You know, in your country, in Uganda, I remember when one of your colleagues said, there's all these public discussions about the value of computing in Ugandan society, and many of those people don't seem to know anything about computing. They're not professors of computer science, they're not electrical engineers. And so sorting out who has qualified knowledge is always a big problem. And it's an especially big problem in emerging areas where very few people may have, in the civil society, may have knowledge that allows them even to have a discussion with the experts. Someone yesterday in a presentation said to me that Alexa, that Amazon has 8,000 people working on voice recognition. Well, how do you try to challenge their knowledge? How would you try to create policies around voice recognition when they have 8,000 people working on something and you've got 5? So there's this ongoing tension about the role of experts. And all I'm saying is, when you look at the public interest concept, can we create space for both reflection about what kind of expertise do you want to harness, if any, and what kind of status will experts have? So if we look at auto safety, which was Ralph Nader's big deal, right? Unsafe at any speed, 1965, cars killed you. The Pinto, the exploding car. The most successful director of the Auto Safety Agency was Joan Clayburgh, who was Ralph Nader's auto safety expert. She went from his public interest group to the head of a regulatory agency. And typically, that is how progressives see themselves capturing or balancing the effects of regulatory capture. John Holdren, who was Obama's science advisor, was with respect to Holdren, he would describe it differently, but he was certainly an activist trying to limit the arms race as a civil society physicist. So when he becomes a science advisor, now he's trying to make science less responsive to the military, more responsive to human needs. But his expertise is not neutral as such.
Thank you for that great question and response, Greg. Anyone else? We have a moment to pause before the second part. Go ahead, Don.
Greg, let's bring it into the present where Jack Dorsey.
Don should not be allowed to ask questions. He asks very, very good ones. This is
that's exactly what you want.
No, not from you, Don. No, go ahead.
So Jack Dorsey and Mr. Zuckerberg were just in Washington being grilled. We just had a difficult election, and those two guys probably had more to say about what Americans saw on their computers and in the social media than anybody. So where's the public interest here, and how does the public interest get captured in a way that both conservatives and liberals feel like there's something fair going on? Is that possible at all?
Well, in further comments, I'm going to address that, because no question that social media and the internet we might just say, coincidentally arise after the end of the Cold War, right? Soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then second, in an era of deregulation fervor, and they were given extraordinary immunity and exemptions from ordinary business liability and ordinary obligations.
Mm.
So the first thing that must be done is we must restore balance so that a public interest movement even has tools with which to challenge these two companies. Let's just say if we focused on them. So you are old enough, and I won't say how old you are, Don, but I know how old you are. And you're
Just a bit older than you.
And we are both old enough to remember the fairness doctrine. We are both old enough to remember when saying something like Heil Hitler on a radio station would probably have immediately led to your arrest, no less your censorship. So we grew up in an era where technologies of communication were controlled. There was a set of obligations that, again, might have, in retrospect, be seen as weak or spurious or, whatever, but compare that to none. Compare that to having no obligations except those you give to yourself. That must end. And I think Europe has done a very good job. The EU has done a good job. And I think the template is the right to be forgotten, which you and I, of course, also are experiencing. We are forgotten. But the right to be forgotten means that
not exactly, but that's all right. That's a different story.
That's true. So we have only goodwill right now in the US to convince a social media provider or an internet, a Google, to withdraw material that's incorrect or certainly hurtful. And that we have a few areas of law, obviously, around children, around specific sexual acts, things like that. But in the main, these companies we can only plead with them to do certain things. That must stop. We must no longer be pleading with them. We must impose a set of laws that compel them to monitor their content. Now, of course, we already have the FCC, but the FCC, because of the Obama administration, because of the Clinton-Gore administration, said we don't want any part of this. This is not part of our responsibilities. And then different federal laws exempted them. But that would be one first step to try to create a set of standards that would have either the force of law or they would be promoted by civil society in some kind of effective way. One thing I'll do now, Katina, is talk a little bit about 100 years ago, radio was the hot technology. And if you want to learn more about the emergence of radio in America, please see Inventing American Broadcasting, 1899 to 1922, by the incomparable Susan J. Douglas, a wonderful scholar. We just marked, although it went unmarked, on November 2nd, the 100th anniversary of the first commercial radio broadcast, which happened in Pittsburgh, November 2nd, 1920. And the broadcast was around the presidential election which Warren Harding won. Government exerted a lot of influence over radio from the get-go. One thing government insisted is not obvious. government insisted that the government owns the airways because there was a belief, physically true, that frequencies were limited and there needed to be a way, like a kind of traffic cop, so people stayed out of each other's way. And then the military wanted a set of frequencies. And this gets imposed as a condition of licensing, that you didn't own the frequencies, you owned your radio station, but the ability to broadcast was a license from the government. And people just have no clue about this, because I'll see many fervent First Amendment absolutists like Dan Gilmore and Jeff Jarvis and others, Clay Shirky, act as if government control over electronic or electrical communication is something out of the Soviet Union. It was done in the United States. These airwaves meant that every commercial radio station, had to provide news on the hour. And when that was removed in the 80s, 90s, these pillars were gradually eliminated by the Reagan administration, and then into the 90s, news vanished. The fairness doctrine, which meant that if someone came on like Donald Trump on their airwaves and said a bunch of things that were lies, you had a legal obligation to bring on a counter viewpoint, and you had a limited time to do it. You might label it as a response, but they had to get a response. And government, as inefficient as it is, as overburdened with rules as it is, managed to figure out how to do this. And no one complained about the fairness doctrine as such, but it was thrown out the window. So by 1934, the Federal Communications Commission is formed, FCC, becomes entrenched, and that was one example of how kind of present at the creation, regulatory agencies were hand in glove with a technology. Another example, and again, we're thinking ahead. What do you do about gene editing? What do you do about, when the computer starts telling you what to do next? 1930s also saw regulatory fervor around electrification. Now, most of us don't think much about electricity, but I unfortunately do. And now that we live in California, we all do. Don, who is a dear friend, Don was subject to 2 or 3 days without electricity in a very fancy neighborhood, by the way. It's part of PGE's program to shut the electricity off in wealthy neighborhoods. And the point is that there were many parts of the US that private power did not deliver electricity to. So Roosevelt signed the Tennessee Valley Authority Act in May of 1933. And it would be something similar like saying, let's have an act that says parts of the US should get free internet or internet through a government agency, because internet's really important. It's an essential service, and electricity became that. And over 20 years, the TVA became the most important public technology initiative in the history of the United States. Now, there were problems. One problem was progressives in that era did not show interest in the environment. So the TVA committed a lot of environmental sins, that's for sure. And during World War II, the TVA became an important part of the Manhattan Project and an important model for how big government worked. And the model we would think of as outdated. So if we fast forward to the 70s, we have this great era of the 30s, launching regulatory agencies that are directly managing emerging technologies. By the 70s, there was much more concern about the environment, obviously the quality of water and air. So the Environmental Protection Agency has begun, and a whole new domain of science-based research and analysis emerges through the EPA. And then secondarily, the FDA does the same. Both of those agencies suffer from regulatory capture. We first saw this in the Reagan presidency, when Reagan put in charge of the EPA and the Department of Interior people that were hostile to these regulatory aims. And we also saw in the 80s airline deregulation, which coupled with the PATCO strike when Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers in one swoop, the combination of deregulating the airlines and firing the air traffic controllers and replacing them created, of course, a lot of controversy and strain, but it unleashed enormous productivity and innovation in the airline business. That new approach, which was seen as a Republican program of the 80s, by the 90s is embraced by Bill Clinton. Of course, what we remember most is the financial deregulation. The Glass-Steagall Act that required investment banks and deposit-taking banks to be separate were allowed to commingle. And this leads to this big financial crisis of 10 years ago. But under Obama, we continue to see requests to regulate technology companies in particular go ignored. The only thing that did happen was Amazon had to start paying taxes. Online retailers had to start paying sales taxes. This was an enormous inequity, and the absurdity of it with malls going out of business and, was too much. But that was the only thing. And then this ideology gets entrenched that all government can do, and by the way, most people in the technology assessment movement are committed to this, is all government can do is provide enabling technologies. And they are trying to create a hospitable atmosphere for American companies to succeed. What we've seen now is, a powerful bipartisan agreement that we've got to impose obligations on big tech in particular. But these movements are handicapped by a lack of tools, which you're referring to, Don, when Dorsey and Zuckerberg give testimony, they can just be embarrassed or shamed, or maybe Dorsey's more liberal and Zuckerberg is more contradictory or hypocritical. They're handicapped by a lack of policy tools and legal tools, and they're impoverished by the imagination of what's possible. Let's take TikTok, for instance. Are Americans going to be happier if Apple's owned by the Japanese, if the Germans own Google, if the Chinese own Facebook? Would that make Americans happier? Because that's what big tech's going to tell you, by the way. Big tech's going to tell you that if you handicap us too much, you may just be the customer of a Chinese company. Would you like that better? So this is a tricky situation. And these reform movements that I consider public interest technology to be part of, they're handicapped by a perverse and often unacknowledged belief in technological determinism, that tech advances always involve trade-offs, and those trade-offs do harm people, and these harms have to somehow be absorbed, and those harmed have to be compensated. The collateral damage of Russian manipulation of elections through Facebook, we absorbed, and we tried to remedy without applying any mandates to Facebook. And another example would be the political control of the FDA or the CDC. That's just collateral damage. And NIH, you know, the National Institutes of Health at $40 billion, you would think would be the #1 target for a public interest technology movement. And yet we don't hear a word about it. Nobody wants to tackle that. This is an agency disconnected from healthcare delivery and has no formal role in fighting COVID, not even a formal role in developing vaccines. This was Operation Warp Speed, does not involve NIH at all. So that's an area that could be fuel or nourish the public interest movement. Getting back to the legislation, if we were in the 1970s and Facebook would have to propose that it planned to live stream events. They would propose that to a regulator, and the regulator would say, what happens if someone live streams a murder or a crime? And then Facebook would say, well, we don't think that'll happen very much. And then one of their executives, we know for sure, a direct report of Zuckerberg, told Zuckerberg in a meeting that, hey, that's the cost, that's the collateral damage of the benefits of freedom. So if 20, 30 people are murdered online, what the heck? Well, now I can just tell you that if you go down to Johnson & Johnson and you remind them about what happened with Tylenol, they didn't say, oh, those people were collateral damage. No, they faced giant lawsuits. The family, the Sadler family, or maybe I'm not pronouncing it right, but the OxyContin family, they didn't just get to say, well, tough noogies, some people died. Oh no, they've been wiped out except for the billions that they squirreled out of the country. So we've got to just provide normal tort law to these big tech companies in the first place, or we need some kind of prior review of clearly controversial features like live streaming, which still is not ended, by the way. It's only monitored by Facebook. As we know, because Katina is from Australia and she pays a lot of attention to New Zealand, we know what happened in New Zealand. Well, I can tell you, they're not functioning on our laws anymore. I mean, I don't know what Facebook's done, but nobody's ever going to live stream a mass murder in New Zealand again. Not if their prime minister has anything to do with it. It's appalling, it's wrong, it must stop now. You just must end these things. And you must do it through legislation. Or you must create a regulatory framework that reviews certain actions in advance. And so the public interest approach has to expand horizons and be more imaginative about ways of thinking, because whole new frameworks need to exist for public interest approach to be robust. Let me just close with a question about what would the agenda be? I mean, obviously, I'm hoping to be a kind of Rasputin figure in Dr. Michael's life. I'll whisper into her digital ear and say, hey, Pitt should do this or Pitt should do that. So this is my opportunity. And so here's an agenda, 5 agenda points, because this is part of the problem. It's the same problem as the future is for everyone. It's a nonsense statement. There's no counter. There's no negative statement. Everyone from philosophy knows truth claims must have a counter statement. So public interest, everyone's for the public interest. No one's against it. Well, that ought to tell you something right there. So you need a set of robust goals. So one goal, which we haven't talked about at all, is jobs and wages. If we know technological unemployment will occur, and of course it will occur, and it's not always bad, but it's of course bad to an individual if they lose their job. And then if jobs are generated by emerging technologies, we have to ensure that these jobs pay enough. Because one thing that I disagree with economists on is how wages arise. Generally, wages have almost no relation to value. Wages tend to be either mandated, bargained for, as in unions, or in some other arbitrary way determined. So I think one thing the public interest movement might do is at least focus on jobs and wages and to try to think through some of the issues there. A second is R&D innovation for environmental and health security. Obviously, if we are spending $40 billion a year in the NIH, and that is more biomedical research than the rest of the world combined, and by the way, California is spending another $5 billion. So we have this enormous capacity. And essentially what we have is a bunch of disease lobbies. We don't, we don't want to have Alzheimer's anymore. We want to defeat cancer. But could there be something more robust there? I think the NIH is ripe for a super duper project on what's the NIH accomplishing? And how might it accomplish more? A third area is I'm just going to call human dignity. That obviously one of the things the Black Lives Movement teaches us is this deep concern that people have for dignity, their own dignity. And one of the things I, of course, most appreciated about the many visits I made to sub-Saharan Africa is some of the enormous sense of dignity, even nobility, that I found in people that I would meet who faced much greater adversity than I ever could. And that sense of dignity arising from everyday life, that's a value in many of these subcultures or cultures in that region. And I of course, married a woman from the Igbo ethnic group, and she also has that sense of dignity. Of course, it's very hard to define, but as we develop technologies, yesterday I listened to a long presentation from a Stanford professor, Nick Mellish, about bioelectronics, the coming era of either implantable electronics, wearable electronics, and obviously, if we just look, and I know a lot of us don't like to. What do you think I'm talking about? No, I know. A lot of us don't like to look at cosmetic surgery and the industry of cosmetic surgery. If that's any indication of what people are going to do, and these are not all people that have suspended rational thought, okay? But if that's any indication of people's behavior, bioelectronics will also breed some undignified results. And how do we manage and think and talk about this? And I'll say this, I know engineer is here, and I'll say this with all due respect, that I wondered what might happen to skin color preferences if there were technologies that could convincingly alter them. You know, I would want to be black, okay? I mean, we know that. I think that's pretty clear, right? But The point is, human dignity is not generally viewed as part of the public interest movement, but because a lot of spiritual claims, a lot of human enhancement movement co-evolving with emerging technologies, I think that that would be an exciting one, and especially exciting for students. Fourth would be civil society and private corporate power. Everyone that looks at the subjects are disappointed about how antitrust law would be applied to big tech. Tim Wu, who worked for Obama and who's written a number of books, one called The Master Switch, which really is just a rehash of telecom policy history. But Tim Wu would like to see Google forced to sell off the browser. I mean, I suppose you could force Apple to divest of its watch line. We could think of a number of things. Certainly, if we don't eliminate Facebook from the planet, we could at least force Facebook to divest WhatsApp, which is a very, very powerful product line, and Instagram. Maybe those were unfortunate. But civil society has to find new ways to address corporate power in these emerging technologies area. And then finally, as a subset of that, civil society and private corporate power, there needs to be a robust program of policy reforms, legislation, and empowerment of regulatory agencies that exist with regards to the digital industries. They are just so large, so powerful, such a big part of the value of our economic life, that there needs to be better tools to address them. They may not be tools that antitrust is comfortable with, because obviously antitrust was created when there were stable markets, and the view that companies would carve up stable markets and behave in predatory ways or anti-competitive ways. That isn't quite, that's often not the situation we face. So, and just quickly in closing, if the broader domain of PIT includes answering the question of how emerging technologies serve the rest of us, we are on firmer ground. In this sense, PIT is a classic response of well-meaning pro-market forces. And in the case of big tech, the public interest movement could be a middle ground between government overreach, compelling actors to do things that might be unhelpful to them and to society, and the status quo, which none of us are happy with, that the digital companies just do whatever they want. It's just a free-for-all. They get to do whatever they want. The timing is great to start this program, content-wise, but in America, where every individual thinks they should manage their own response to the health crisis, we are likely to see false starts, misdirections, and a lot of noise around efforts to rein in big tech. And some of this noise, by the way, comes from First Amendment absolutists, who are nearly all liberals. I mean, as much as I like the ACLU, very clearly there are a number of members on the board of the ACLU that think what goes on at Facebook must stop. And it's not a question of asking Facebook to stop it. It's not a question of just, is this Republicans? No, it's both sides. And how can public interest approaches nurture, manage, sustain, balance innovation for human thriving? I think there's a lot of emphasis on technical and tactics procedures and processes, but what are the aims? What are we looking for? Rather than say what the STS people and with a lot of conservatives say is, let's see what arises in the market. Let's see what civil society wants. No, I think these are the questions are too difficult to expect the answers to come out the back end. We've got to make some decisions up front about what we want. And I think the public interest movement can help. So thanks for giving me the chance to talk, and I'm happy to continue the conversation now. I think I've laid out my positions.
And you've done so really specifically, eloquently, forcedly, I might say, questioning certain things, which I'm glad you have, Greg. That always helps in a discussion. And you've triggered ideas in me already, things that we've already talked about in the group. I want to share one screen, which is, it goes to what you were talking about. I mean, this shows a working paper on the number of murders that have gone over on Facebook, and we've catalogued them down to the mid 2019 so far, whether there was filming, direct harm, sharing, and a whole lot more. But the list goes on and on. It's actually too much. And at one point, wanting to work with one of the co-authors, collaborate, she basically said to me, can't do this. And so while we're talking about lives and numbers of lives that have been filmed, it's a life is a huge thing. We've also got this one that I wanted to share that was given to me by Tracy Morris, who heads API, the American Indian Policy Institute at ASU. Tracy is a wonderful advocate for access to the internet. And you mentioned a number of areas that have started to be incorporated in the innovation design process. And you can see here, this is really an American Indian sort of more robust view of design and what's relevant in innovation in the context of individuals from this background. And so you mentioned spirituality many times, and I totally agree with you. While we can embrace the value set and the spirituality, well, you could ask 10 people, what do you believe in? And they'll give you 10 different answers. How does that unify us in some way? But somebody mentioned in a previous podcast I was just on an hour ago about culture and the importance of culture. We were looking at digital services for youth online, and culture played a part. An 18-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 2-year-old, depending on the cultural setting, may be able to access different kinds of content. But then this big chunk here, sustainability, this big chunk of community, the environment, economics, of course, socioeconomics and so forth. But I just wanted to share that as something that has come up. But also, and you're going to give me a moment, I've just lost the graphic that I wanted to share. Maurizio Meyer from the design school has been throwing up some wonderful diagrams. And this one is one that I latched on with Dr. Robert Abbas online, and we had a meeting with Maurizio. And then I used it as an intervention in my own classroom. I'll get to that in one moment. I may have just passed it in the list here, but it really beautifully looked at the design process from the very beginning. And so you said something quite amazing. After the fact is sort of too late. We've got to get better at designing, right? You've got to get better at embedding. So if I share my screen here and get to this diagram, I want us just to pause for a second and have a look at this. So what type of society are we designing, he says. And if we look at sort of the colonial model, it was like for the masses, right? Industrial revolution. If we design for inclusion, communities come together sort of in a one world for everyone. And if we claim we're designing for individual groups, then what we might have is a pluriverse. And of course, this came from Arturo, and I can't remember the surname, but this design sort of steps or stages that we've seen over the last 200 years is not Maurizio's. Maurizio's just brought it to life diagrammatically. But my students said they would love it, I ran this by them, they would love to design for inclusion with this pluriverse within this one sort of world view. Very interesting, I thought, coming from young people in their 20s. But the other thing I was told this week is that even if we say we're building for communities, for example, the Aboriginal community in Australia, we've made an assumption that all Aboriginal people in Australia believe the same thing, which is completely incorrect. One of my friends has come out with a paper on the politics of sameness, and it's not really the same. We see it as the same, but it's not the same. You know, it's like when people say, oh, you know, you're Asian, without identifying where the individual is from in Asia, and even within which province they're from and which community in that province they're from. So can this, Greg, these models, are you an advocate of being able to design in a way that can actually maximize the public interest?
Well,
do you think that?
Absolutely. And in fact, that generative side was part of the remit of the muscular state and the regulatory apparatus. I mean, TVA was viewed as a spear or arrow. Electrification would enable all these downstream, benefits. So that was, of course, a top-down design. But no, I think you're absolutely right that more thinking about what we want from the start, as opposed to looking at what we get and saying, how do we respond to it? This is why I think NIH is really important, because what we would like is we're spending now $1 trillion a year on Medicare. And interestingly, NIH has no relationship with Medicare. Medicare is not a customer. It would be as if Apple had an R&D lab that didn't have any relationship to Apple's product line, or Google had an R&D lab and had no relationship to what the company was doing. So when we look at, well, we know from study after study that out of that $1 trillion, 300 billion is fraud, 300 billion is wasted through the misdiagnosis. So it's a special kind of waste. You don't get an outcome, but maybe people were trying. And then, about 400 billion is actually doing something. Well, what might happen at the R&D side to generate the outcomes we would like, more outcomes we would like? And I think that at ASU, when I was attracted, and of course by our very inspirational president, Dr. Michael Crow, he used to speak a lot about outcome-oriented research. And in terms of progressive reform efforts, targeting is a particular interest of mine, because targeting, what are we targeting? We're targeting the outcomes we want. Apollo program was targeting, right? Having NSF have more awards to women and people of color, young scientists, the target is to have more of them become old scientists. And so targeting works, but it's not a panacea, and it's harder to do than it looks, because I mean, we did a lot of targeting. The one thing, we did a lot of targeting around solar in the Obama administration. Unfortunately, it was the one targeting that was done, and that didn't work out well. But you would think that we could get, and targeting to me is different than mission-oriented research. To bring engineer in who's there, is his project on the African cloud with a former guy from Microsoft is targeting. There is no cloud. There's no African-based cloud. The cloud is somewhere else, right, engineer? It's somewhere else. And so if we want to get a cloud in Africa, we got to build one. And so I think that much more targeting would be important.
Okay, Greg, we've got so many questions, my friend. I'm going to go to Michael Eldred and try to give one person each an opportunity to speak. So Greg, if we can keep maybe the answers a little bit shorter,
Absolutely.
just so
Absolutely.
that I could get more people in, because everyone's sort of waiting. You should see it go hot. So Michael Eldred, I'm not sure if you're able to speak and share. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to pose a couple of questions. The Greg's presentation has been so wide-ranging. I don't know whether we can get a focus on these at all, but I at least want to throw these questions into the
Oh, I'm
crowd.
very grateful.
Yeah.
Your reputation precedes you.
Yeah. Well, the first bunch of questions was with this whole thing about publics being, you emphasize the plural. And so I understand that publics are various bunches of subjects endowed with consciousness. These consciousnesses are then individual, and these subjects strive for something or other in their lives, their values, and they strive for income. And their interests consist in what they value and strive for. And PIT is a movement, you'd call it a movement, predicated on the democratic idea of the subjects in various publics being or gaining control of what happens with digital technologies. And you emphasized there that there's a role for the state there in its various agencies of providing regulation for assessing what these technologies are and so forth. So a kind of providing the framework for this striving of these various subjects, bunches of subjects to achieve or at least strive for their interests. Okay, that's one set of questions. The other set I have relates more to digital technology. You've taken digital technology for granted that it exists, which it does. it's a correct fact. And you also take for granted that with things like the cloud and the internet and so forth. And my question is, well, what is this digital technology more particularly? And is its consummation the cyber world in which we now live ever more, as or to ever greater extent? Mm-hmm. And going back to Turing's 1936 paper, where he actually invents the Turing machine, and as is well known in computer science, anything that a computer can do to a supercomputer, even a quantum computer, can be done in principle by a very dumb Turing machine, which just reads one bit at a time with its scanning head and moves one space to the left, one space to the right, and they're equivalent. So my conception is that this, what Turing put in this very mathematical paper in 36, where he actually invents the Turing machine and says that a Turing machine is nothing other than a very dumb, simple machine that copulates one bit string, which is the algorithm. I'm talking about a universal. One bit stream, it consists simply as just a binary number. It gets an input, which is just another bit string, and it computes a third number. That's all that Turing machine can do. And in fact, it's all that the cyber world can do. So my thesis is then, is the cyber world itself inhabited, are the denizens of the cyber world simply trillions and trillions and trillions of bit strings copulating with each other in trillions and trillions and trillions of Turing machines? as a conception, although this is something you cannot go out into the world. You will never find, if you go into the internet, into the backbone, into the roots, you will not find a single Turing machine. This is an idea. It's an idea that was conceived by Turing, and it turns out to be equivalent to anything the cyber world can do with all its problems, with the viruses and whatever it is. Okay, is that well, just let me finish with, just let me finish this off. This conception of the cyber world just consisting of trillions and trillions of copulating bit strings. Does this cyber world fulfill the dream of total control over movement that we inherited from the Greeks? And then how could bunches of subjects endowed with consciousness gain control over the cyber world without radically changing their shared mindset? So I emphasize here you have individual subjects with individual consciousnesses, but they inevitably and inescapably share a certain mindset. For example, with respect to what is this cyber world, what is the cloud, and so on. So how could they get a handle upon the cyber world without changing their mindset? And what does a change of thinking, which you spoke about, entail on a deeper level? Is it an empiricist problem that can be decided by the facts, or do you have to dig deeper than the facts, the correct facts, to another truth which brings to light what is digital technology? What is technology at all? What does it have to do with controlling movement? That's it. Okay.
Let me just say something really succinct to these deep 4 different points that were not particularly the focus of mine, but these are quite current concerns and they're difficult. So the first thing is, there can be collective publics. I don't define, to me, I think that whether we call it race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, there are collectives and they are publics. So to me, it's not a single consciousness and aggregation of them, not only. Second, the new forms, even the internet may go away. Maybe we'll wake up one day, there's no internet. So I do think that while we're very focused on what we think of as social media or search or texting, or those could all go away and we end up with something totally different. So, and I think that's important, because if we have a movement, say, based on managing live streaming, and suddenly something else happens that is more like the TV show Persons of Interest, where everything all over the world is being filmed and available for viewing. So I agree with you there that we can't.
Will Turing machines go away?
Well, hang on. And so then the third one is, I agree with why I introduced human dignity is, I do think that because of the capabilities of digital networks and the competition that's inevitable with humans in some domains, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in, and what kind of how privileged are humans? I mean, lately, honestly, I have been haunted by regret that humans colonized the planet, that things were a lot better when we were less powerful. So, but I'm just saying, human dignity is a big question, because I mean, the singularity people who seem to relish merger with the web, so, and then so the human dignity question is important. And then the last one I would just say is, and I've said this to Katina, and it's that values matter. We are not going to derive values from the epiphenomena of the market or the epiphenomena of civil society. and we're certainly not going to derive values from originalist interpretations of the US Constitution. That clearly is a failed project. So, but how do we come up with values that then would animate, influence the technological systems we support? So your questions are really good, and they're kind of a very big concern in some sense that's parallel and stands behind and underneath the tactics that many people in the politics of science and politics of engineering are grappling with.
Great discussion, folks.
Yeah, thanks.
Great discussion. Great discussion. Deep. We had one person comment, Greg, that they love the human dignity perspective, that values matter, and said that sounds familiar. I think we spent the week talking about that last week, but also,
Well,
Michael, your question's very pertinent as always, piercing to the heart of the issues here. I want us to go to Jason Sargent, and I don't know, Jason, if you're available to speak, but you had something you wanted to show. It was a link. Are you able to unmute? Is that a good time, or you're marking? Where are you? Yes.
I'm here. G'day, Greg from Melbourne, down under.
Okay.
I sent a link through, but it was about the elders, elders.org, which Nelson Mandela set up. And then I was looking in the background of Kat there with the movie poster. And I think in her house somewhere, there's the Sound of Music poster or something like that. There's probably a DVD up on the shelf, Katina, I'm sure. So my sort of question around experts, it got me thinking, how do we solve a problem like Maria? But Maria for us is the experts. So what if we had these more statesman-like panel to sort of fall back? And that's what I was hoping the US would give us. I thought, I don't live in America, but I thought somebody like a statesman would come in over the top and say, enough is enough of this rubbish. Mm-hmm. And so with the experts, having the technical people go in the field are experts. But if you had this sort of emeritus people of trust that you could fall back on, maybe that's one way that we could get more oversight, I guess, in the public interest technology. And then the other one was just Jim Fruchterman, who you may know from California and Benetech. And he has a black marker and he just writes on his arms right across, technology should serve all of humanity. And that's sort of his mantra. But really it was just about to get your thoughts on this idea of how about we have an elders or emeritus elders, right, to help us out here to be that devil and the advocate on both sides, so stuff like that.
I'm very, very drawn to that idea. I put it in, the Platonic philosopher kings, and basically the way World War II was run, that there were these wise men. So what America, the United States is struggling with is pluralism versus expertise. So every governor has his opinion about the pandemic. Every county had a presidential election. We got 3,000 of them. So we are way on the extreme end of pluralism. And it seems like for us to look at the philosopher kings, the elders, the wise people, and I don't think the diversity problem is the showstopper. I think that American culture and society are just now so at odds with the idea that there are some subjects that these wise people could answer. But this is a little bit gets to, it would be these elders that might help generate the values that are then the guiding forms that the technologies might take. We had a consensus during different periods. I mean, there was a consensus in the West that Hitler was bad. I mean, there was a consensus in the West that the Soviet system was too flawed, whatever benefits it delivered. We don't seem, in the United States, it's shocking. We don't seem to have a consensus now over wearing a mask. I don't want to go too far off the deep end, as Katina knows I'm capable of, but it would be as if half of the American men decided they would go without any clothes on from the waist down because no one's going to abridge their freedom. It would be as if suddenly there was a movement of Americans who said, I'm not stopping at stop signs. That's some bullshit conspiracy. Stop signs aren't any good. They're slowing me down. I mean, that's the level this is on. So we're so far. Now, the good news is the pluralism may get so corrosive, it may get so costly that we decide to, all pull together and maybe, try this. Obviously, the elders, the wise people would on their face have to be a diverse ethno-racial gender group. But even if we stipulate that, there's so much resistance now to having people in advance say, this is desirable for our technologies. And what passed for moderates in the United States are completely captive to the libertarian ideal. They say our values must be derived from our preferences and activities. But this takes us back to I'm not a big fan of the Sony CEO, Morita, but Steve Jobs said the same thing. You don't know what you want. You didn't know you wanted an Apple Watch. You didn't know you wanted an iPod. We gave it to you and you liked it. This is, to me, a long way from the Nietzschean herd or the idea that most people are just sheep. No, I think that we have a tension between what we know we want and what we don't know we need or should want. And we're doing very poorly at adjudicating this. And technologies are at the heart of this. The most divisive issue in American politics, and it drove Trump's support, is anti-abortion. And abortion's a technology. It's a neo-Luddite movement on the right. Oh, you have a technology that can assist you in achieving your life goals, but I'm I'm a group of people that say you can't use it. So I have always looked at the anti-abortion movement as an anti-technology movement. And so many of the vaccines, these anti-technology movements, they're just building on the abortion movement. And I think that unfortunately the abortion rights people have seen abortion as a right that is for women and benefits women. But it's really about the kinds of technologies that we would have. But remember that we had a campaign in 2012 where two Republican candidates, one was Rick Santorum, said they refused to get amniocentesis. That they wouldn't even do, and both had developmentally handicapped children, both the candidates. The other was Michelle Bachmann, who thankfully we don't hear from anymore. But the point is that we have in the United States deep resistance to emerging technologies that we might think of as assisting human dignity. So very hard situation. And you're from Australia, you said Melbourne?
Yeah, that's right. So we went through 120 something days of wearing masks and lockdown, and we're out the other side at the moment, which is good, and the sun's out, and so it's very good. Just to quickly finish off, I was at the SIT conference the last couple of days, and I think it has restored my faith. And I think there are a lot of young people coming through, Greg, who are going to stand up and say, look, we've had enough of this. It's time we said something. And so there were a lot of good young people there. So it was good to see. Thanks again.
Yes, thank you, Jason. I'll drop you a note.
We also had a question from Mohammed Ibrahim, who's had to go offline. I think Jason Sargent, just double checking. Yes, he has. Yeah, and he said, is he teaching or in class?
No, there's just a lot going on in Somalia, Ethiopia, Horn of Africa with the current things at the moment, and diaspora are very busy.
How would you introduce Mohammed Ibrahim to Greg, Jason?
Well, he's my PhD student that I share with another colleague, Paul Skyfleet, but amazing history of a previous ICT minister in one of the, I think, third transitional Somali government, but has been in Australia as an Australian citizen, but really involved and very agnostic in what technology should be doing in countries, so that there's no sort of agenda, I think, and post great things on LinkedIn. But way back when Google Loon was thinking and trying to get access to countries, he was the telecom minister, and Google Loon went through Kenya because they could get the air rights, I think. And so they've started again, and Mohammed was just asking about who would give permission for a company like Google or Alphabet, you know, to be able to send their balloons across around the world in those different stratospheres and the wind patterns. Thinking again to give internet access to those who are incapable, unable to access it. So I think that was his question from the chat. But he's looking at digital finance and
Yes,
inclusion.
I think he said,
yeah, and how you can jump over, maybe leapfrog a generation of digital literacy. So people who are not digital literate, but the unbanked, unbankable, all these sort of things he's looking at in his PhD.
thank you, Jason, because that's important.
And one quick comment to that, Jason, it's simply that part of the paradoxes and contradictions we're facing is in a failed state like Somalia that has 3 regions that function somewhat autonomously, sometimes a multinational corporation offers a set of solutions that the state can't. And Google has been especially good at engaging African scientists and civil society people in ways that, say, the UN agencies don't have the talent or the resources to do, perhaps.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I think Mohammed will reach out to you, Greg, because he's already been speaking one-on-one to the Google Loon team. That's just how he operates, reaches straight out.
Yeah, I can put him in touch with some other
yeah.
people.
Okay, that'd be great.
And I'd like to, I'll get from Katina the emails of everybody.
Yeah.
So I can.
All right. Thanks again.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Greg, we have a wonderful student here from SFIS who's our first enrollee in the Public Interest Technology Program. That's Ms. Toby Shurif. She has a question.
Okay.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk so far. It has been very thought-provoking.
Okay, thanks for your patience.
Oh, please. I could spend another 2 hours listening to the conversation. So my question is, you may be pleased to know that the sort of inaugural class, like the actual session that we sat in at the beginning of this program, really explored and dove into those ideas of who are publics, what is interests. It was something that we read and talked and really struggled deeply with.
Great.
Yeah, not that we came up with some great solution. I mean, I would share it if I did.
Just be reflective about it. Absolutely.
For sure. And so I really noticed the point at which you said that it was sort of to the side, but this idea that a regulatory framework might review certain things in advance. And this was a lot of what we were focusing on in the class is how do you build into design, into development, into innovation, public interest? Because once it's already established, it's harder to correct. And so I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that, to what you see as, you know, not just pleading with industry, with tech developers to sort of be good, but what kind of ways we can check as design and development are happening.
Well, one thing is, I think you should be confident that the public interest or values or geographies, these are similar to other constraints on design and engineering that designers and engineers face all the time. They always face constraints. So constraints are limitations on their ability to act. One of the most important constraints for the iPhone initially was getting a screen that was not going to break so easily and could be, you know, certain cost. So you couldn't build them until that constraint was removed. This same iPhone, the Apple apps, while it's not a closed universe, the App Store is. And Steve Jobs and Tim Cook has continued it, made certain decisions about what can be on the App Store. And if you contrast what can be on the App Store with what the founders of Instagram decided could be on Instagram, well, you see right away that choices in advance make a big difference. Instagram is mostly a vehicle for celebrities and other entertainers to display themselves. Apple is not going to have, Apple is not going to have anything to do with that. They did not create that kind of framework. And so we used to call these closed systems. Now, I was always very interested in closed systems as opposed to open ones. I thought the open ones were the so-called open systems, which your generation, meaning anybody under 35, open systems, that's it. No constraints, no limits. I can do anything. So now we have to revert back in some constraints. So the principle of values shaping our choices cannot be denied. Once you get the engineers to agree that they have constraints, they're just different ones than you care about. Mostly they're constraints about materials, about durability, about costs, et cetera. Some of them are ergonomic. If they concede to you that they design with constraints, you're just saying, hey, buddy, here's a new set of constraints you've got. And we're going to impose these on you because you're part of a civil society that is going to coexist. So, I mean, the debate over above ground testing, it was a really good example of nuclear weapons designers were exploding hydrogen bombs in the Pacific Ocean. I mean, one of the things that one of the reasons that this always interests me to talk about is many young Americans believe that we have been trying to protect the environment for a long time. And in fact, we did not. So once we impose the constraint of forcing nuclear weapons to be tested underground, interestingly, we did not lose our ability to improve them, which was one of the original arguments that, well, we won't be able to test enough. We don't even know if we can contain these tests, et cetera. So sometimes again, and everyone at Livermore Labs will tell you, oh, they love underground nuclear explosions. They just love them because they're underground. You're not blowing up an island. You're not harming people. And so it gave them more freedom. So, constraints can sometimes generate more innovation. So I do think that making a robust case for the principle that you can impose constraints is the start. And then deciding what constraints people are willing to accept, is harder. But the principle is often where you get the lethal objections from scientists and engineers is, oh no, we're not subject to constraints. No. Yeah, I'll take away their salaries though, and you see how quickly they get constrained. You don't see a lot of people showing up to work as a scientist without a salary. So the first thing we would do is just say, hey, that's your attitude. I'm going to stop paying you. Now, what do you think? So, I mean, we just have so many levers. So to do that, and I think we should have the honesty to make mistakes and try to recover from them, rather than to just say this is too hard. We've got to try. The results we're getting are terrible. The internet has turned into it's awful now. And the levels of problems are so difficult now to manage because of it. So we've got to do better. And I think that, is there going to be a new internet, or will it just be these private internets? There's so many questions of design that might be of interest and would certainly make interesting projects. Like if we were to shut the internet, if we were just to decide we're turning this off, what would we turn on instead? there are people working on that. It's just, you know, it's like you got a moving train, and you know, how do you get off and on it? But no, I think these are really good questions.
Thank you. And Toby, any final remarks or reflections?
I picked up on what you were saying about open and closed systems. So in my day job outside of studies, I work at the intersection of technology and gender-based violence. And I think just a very concrete example for me is that closed environment of the App Store does not allow for stalkerware, right? It doesn't allow for also called spyware monitoring software, right?
Oh, thank you.
They value decisions about what is acceptable to be their company, but they're not obligated to do that, right? They're doing that because they're coming from the right place. Is that enough?
Well, what I would just say is pay more attention to this, because there's a powerful lobby, a powerful moneyed elite, from Peter Thiel to many others in the digital industries, that don't want any constraints. And Steve Jobs is no longer with us. So you've lost a powerful voice for that. But no, those are great examples about violence against women, and do technologies enable them, and how would you take that away? Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I hope that we have a chance to interact in future, and thank you for you have a marvelous mentor in Dr. Michael, and I was just really grateful for the chance to do this with you all, and I learned a lot, and I appreciate that. My sister.
Well, it's always wonderful when our family would like to listen to us. That's a definite. Greg, we're very honored to have had you in this series of 3 talks. So
all mine. It is.
Well, we've had Dr. Eldred.
We can be in touch as well. I'll get your email, because you're asking some really important spiritual, psychological values questions.
Yeah, that's what he's known for, Michael Eldred. And the third speaker will be a theologian. So I don't know if you want to turn up to that, Michael Eldred and Greg Zachary.
Yes, I would.
That'll be next year. I just wanted to thank everyone for their support this year. We launched in September when we launched the Public Interest Technology Colloquium. We've had a minimum of 15 people at every single talk each week, and committed souls coming back and supporting us at the conference at the PIT UN. I just want to say a big thank you for the last colloquium of the year. We are going to observe no colloquium in 2 weeks, for the mere fact that our students are submitting and are in examination mode during that week. But otherwise, I wish everyone a good Thanksgiving, a happy Thanksgiving. May you celebrate with your loved ones, partners, pets, whatever it is that's near you. And from us to all of you in America, happy Thanksgiving. Bye for now.